me, doctor, where are we going this time? Is this the 50s or 1999? Anyway, hey everybody, this is Cave Cat once more, this time to bring you episode 33 of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. In case any of you couldn't tell by the song that I was singing, today's episode is going to be an animated series based on a trilogy of time travel films that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. That would be Back to the Future, the animated series. Yes, the Back to the Future films actually got an animated series. There were a lot of live-action films from the 80s and the 90s that got animated series, such as RoboCop, Ghostbusters, Beetlejuice, Teen Wolf, The Never-Ending Story, and many others. But a lot of people certainly did not expect Back to the Future to get its own animated series, even after the third film ended the trilogy with a bang. But anyway, despite the fact that Back to the Future Part 3 ended with Doc Brown and his new family leaving Marty and Jennifer, CBS and Universal actually teamed up with each other to make an animated series based on the films. And thus, Back to the Future, the animated series, was born. To give a quick summary of the show as a whole, Doc Brown and his family, consisting of his wife Clara and their two children Jules and Vern, have moved into Hill Valley in the year 1991, which was the year that the show was released, all the while that Marty also teams up with them on their adventures through time. Aside from the familiar main characters, this series also includes Biff Tannen, the main antagonist from the live-action films. And much like the live-action films, aside from including the ancestors and descendants of Doc Brown's family and Marty's family, we also get to see the ancestors and descendants of Biff's family as well, which was a pretty nice touch. And also, unlike the live-action films, the different time periods that Marty, Doc Brown, and the rest of Doc's family travel to are not just limited to their hometown of Hill Valley. What am I talking about, you ask? Well, what I mean is that in the live-action films, whenever Marty and Doc Brown went back in time, they always stayed in Hill Valley. The animated series changes it so that Doc Brown and Marty and the others go back in time to different places, just by inserting the place and the time by the use of the time circuits, and presto, they're instantly transported to that place in the allotted time. But even in spite of this change, the premise still remains the same from that of the live-action films, right down to the main characters encountering their ancestors and descendants, along with those of Biff. Aside from the familiar characters like Marty, Doc, and Clara, we're also introduced to Doc and Clara's children, more specifically their sons, Jules and Vern. And even though Jules and Vern did appear at the end of the third film, they didn't have any lines. But here in the series, their personalities are actually fleshed out more, with Jules being the older son who believes in using logic and science to solve the problem at hand, though he's a bit of a geek and not all that popular in school, while Vern is the younger son who tends to be rather rambunctious and act rather impulsively, yet is also very popular in school in contrast to that of Jules. The other characters from the films still keep their personalities as they were in the films, with Marty being the aspiring young rock star who just can't seem to stay out of trouble, Doc Brown being the brilliant yet eccentric scientist, Clara, his wife, being the matronly one of the family who makes it her job to keep things together in the family, and finally, Biff is the mandatory antagonist of the series, along with his ancestors and descendants in various time periods, past and future. Not only do we get the main characters from the live-action films, but in the case of Biff, we get another new character, which is his son, Biff Tannen Jr., voiced by former child actor Benji Gregory, God rest his soul. But anyway, speaking of the voice cast, I really think that the actors that were brought in to voice the characters did a great job with what they were given. For example, instead of being played by Christopher Lloyd like in the films, Doc Brown was instead voiced by Dan Castellaneta, more famously known for voicing Homer Simpson and several other characters in The Simpsons. And despite sounding a little bit like Homer at times, Dan actually did a good job capturing Christopher Lloyd's portrayal of Doc Brown. David Kaufman did a pretty good job voicing Marty, years before he would later go on to voice the title character of Nickelodeon's Danny Phantom. Not to mention that Mary Steenburgen, who played Clara in the third film, would later reprise the role for the animated series, as did Thomas F. Wilson for his role of Biff from the films, so they're pretty much the only two actors to reprise their roles from the live-action films. And as for the series, it's actually a pretty enjoyable spin-off series of the Back to the Future films. It's fun to see which time period the entire gang travel to, whether to learn more about the environment around them or to try and help their ancestors and descendants try to overcome their own problems so that they can become successful as history intends. I mean, yeah, it's a little bit similar to what happened in the first film, where inadvertently interfering with past events can cause history to slowly change, but it still worked, especially when Marty was able to covertly help things get better for his parents back in 1955. However, there was one episode where Vern went back to time in the time of when Clara's parents were still living, while Marty and Jules also tagged along as well, but upon doing so, accidentally causes Vern's grandmother, i.e., Clara's future mother, to fall in love with Marty instead of with Clara's future father. That episode even had Marty make a reference to the first film where he alludes to the time that he went back in time and met his parents in their youth. Also, like the first film, Vern's inadvertent interference with history ends up causing Clara to gradually fade away from existence. But thanks to Doc going back in time to find out what's going on, history eventually ends up getting set back on track once more. So yeah, much like with the real Ghostbusters, the Back to the Future animated series makes lots of references to that of the live-action films, and a lot of them actually work too. Though I do remember hearing that also like with the real Ghostbusters, the Back to the Future animated series is supposedly set in a different continuity than that of the actual films. You can believe one or the other, but I think I stand by the fact that the Back to the Future animated series actually continues where the third film left off. But anyway, another thing to bring up is the fact that even though Christopher Lloyd does not reprise his role as Doc Brown in the actual animated series, he actually does play Doc Brown in the live action segments that precede and end the actual episode. The reason for this is because each episode begins with the live action Doc relaying an incident that happened that was related to what he was doing in the live action segment. And once the episode has wrapped up, Doc will then proceed to present an experiment that was related to what happened in the episode. Surprisingly enough, these experiments end up being performed by Bill Nye. That's right, the Bill Nye, who would later go on to star in Bill Nye the Science Guy. It's appropriate that he would perform a multitude of science experiments, let alone that this was actually the first time that Bill Nye would actually appear in a nationally broadcast television show. However, even in spite of these amazing elements, there's actually one gripe about the show that I can name, which is the fact that Marty has been sidelined as a supporting character with Doc Brown and his family taking the spotlight, whereas Marty was the main character in the live action films in contrast to that of Doc. But even in spite of this glaring change from the films, the animated series is still an enjoyable and educational journey through time, pun intended. So it is to this end that I will give Back to the Future the animated series 8.5 stars. There's not really much left for me to say about this series, except for the fact that I'm actually glad that the filmmakers decided not to make a fourth film, or at the very least make a remake of the live action films. Though they did make a game based on the Back to the Future films to make it feel like a fourth film, but not by much, even if I never played the game. Besides, if they ever did make an actual fourth film, or a remake or reboot of the films, odds are that it'll end up taking away the charm of the original films. It's like what I talked about in my The New Adventures of Winnie the Pooh review, where making remakes of old films or old TV shows can result in a very mixed reaction. They can either capture the style of the original, or they end up lacking the soul that the original had. Most of the time, it ends up being the latter. But in the case of making animated series based on live action films, it can also be a mixed bag. But at least audiences can be easier on it since it's animated rather than live action, unless the animation ends up looking rather bad. Either way, the show can end up being either really good or really bad, depending on the film being adapted, so it shouldn't be any contest. Anyway, that about wraps it up for this episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. And as before, if you really enjoy my videos, then don't forget to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more episodes, or whatever video that I'll come up with next. In the words of Doc Brown, where we're going, we don't need roads. So until next time, later!